Great. So welcome to all of you. Good early afternoon if you're here in New York, or good morning or late afternoon or evening, depending on where you are in the world. I'm very happy today that we're joined by Julie Golia, who is an alum of the history department here at Columbia and currently works at the New York Public Library. I'm not going to introduce Julie any further because I want her to tell us about what she does, but the format of this event is we'll have a little conversation. I'll ask Julie a few questions and she'll talk and tell us about her path. And then we'll make sure to save plenty of time at the end for your questions and conversation for Julie as well. And just so you know, that conversation at the end won't be recorded. It'll just be this, this early part with me and Julie that'll be recorded. Great, so with that, Julie, can you start just in the present and by telling us what you do now, what your current work is?
So I am the curator of history, social sciences, and government information at the New York Public Library. I'm still practicing saying that long title because it's a relatively new one. I arrived there in February, so I got just a few weeks of in-person work until I started my new job completely remotely. And so in some ways, the description that I will give you of what I do is something that I've had to kind of make up along the way because the field that I work in has been transformed so profoundly by COVID and all of the kind of related issues of that. So I have a couple responsibilities that are sort of different in many ways. One of them is collection development. So I'm responsible for all the collections in our institution related to history. So everything from, making sure we have the right books going into the general collections to fostering small presses related to history. I play a role in stewarding manuscript collections and then one thing I'm particularly interested in is oral history and born digital collections, and I'll talk more about that in a second. So building the collections, the research collections that people are using now and will be using in the future. Another thing I'm responsible for is telling people about how enormously amazing our collections are and making sure they're being used by people. And related to that, supporting research projects. So a thing that I've been really interested in promoting in this job is the idea that the library can be kind of a broad place to bring people together to talk about the process of doing scholarship. That is something actually I would say I loved my experience at Columbia, but I didn't get a lot of practical, this is how you do research guidance. It was sort of like, go do research. And I figured it out along the way with the help of a lot of librarians and archivists and many others and my colleagues. And things like learning how to organize my research, build databases, think about how to sort of crunch numbers, how to draw from different fields in my work. That was stuff I had to figure out on my own. And I feel pretty strongly that you shouldn't have to figure it out on your own. And so I want NYPL to be that kind of place. And then the third part of my job is what I have been doing for about a decade, which is curatorial work. So I was an exhibition curator, chief curator at the Brooklyn Historical Society for about a decade before this. And I'm excited to begin working on exhibitions at NYPL, but that is a big part of my job that has been kind of put to the side because people are not going to be going to exhibitions for a while. So an important part of my job and any job is the enormous flexibility that you have to have in normal times, but particularly in times like this.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm curious, so you started this position recently. What made you make the move from the Brooklyn Historical Society, or kind of how did that move happen?
That's a great question, and I think actually an important and applicable one for everybody here. So I went from working at a pretty small institution, though not the smallest kind, but like maybe the next up small. We had about 25 full-time staff people at Brooklyn Historical Society, to unquestionably a very large institution with thousands of employees doing so many different kinds of roles. So one of the things that I loved about EHS is that I could do my kind of history. I could do my kind of scholarship. And the institution really believed, I would say really believed in that vision. And that was enormously important to me. And so I would come up with ideas and I would raise money to do them. And I would do them. And I got to do exhibitions on like the history of letter writing during the Civil War and on the history of public health in Brooklyn and on the environmental and social history of the waterfront. I would come up with these ideas and I would pitch them and I would get to do them. And the downside of working at a small institution is, I think, it's a money thing, which we have to talk about. You know, it's just the budget is limited and the scope is limited. It's an audience thing that institutions are limited in the number of audiences when they're that small. And I think the big thing that drew me to the library was the incomparable collections, just the vastness of the resources there. And I think particularly the audience, that I would be able to, I think, bring my approach to public scholarship to just incredibly wide audience, and one that is not just local, but is national and global in scope. And then the downside of that is that you have to work with bureaucracy in a way that you didn't before. You know, BHS was the wild, wild west. And, NYPL is not, you know. I mean, a great example of this, just, I will talk about finances and money a lot, is that at BHS, I would say, we're going to write this NEH grant. And I would have no competition because I was the only one who was writing NEH grants. And at NYPL, you have to get in line, right, to apply to federal funders, because there's so many people who qualify for those kinds of grants. And there is an entire office that is committed to just kind of fielding who is going to be doing what. So it's almost the opposite in terms of that experience. And I think there's pluses and minuses with both of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. I bet students might have follow-up questions about those differences a little bit later. But I know a lot of students had the question coming into this about how you got your first position at the Brooklyn Historical Society coming straight from graduate school.
I might talk about how I got my previous job, which then got me the job at Brooklyn Historical Society.
Okay, yeah.
And actually, in a way, I will go back further, although I won't go too deep. But I came into graduate school pretty confident that I didn't want to go into academia. And I would say, like most people who enter a cult, which is what academia kind of is, I was swayed, largely because I loved teaching. So, you know, I kind of was like, oh, maybe I do want to go into academia. But nonetheless, I did public history work all throughout my time in graduate school. Everything from working as kind of an assistant curator at the Rare Books and Manuscript Library via a summer grant that I got there, to becoming a licensed New York City walking tour guide and working for Big Onion, which was one of the best jobs I've ever had in my whole life, to just kind of going to what became my first employer, the New York Historical Society, and saying, I want to build skills. I want to work on exhibitions. I want to work with the public. What can I do? And I worked in a number of different departments there during my graduate school work, and eventually used one of the connections I got there to get my first job there. Right at the end of graduate school, I was assistant historian for special projects, and I was one of the curators on the permanent exhibit that just recently came down there. That was up for about 7 years, from 2011 to about 2018. And that was a thing where the curator was telling me about it, and I was at a talk with them, and I said, you need to hire me, you need me. And I just convinced them as to why they needed me. And at first they thought they maybe only needed me part-time, and then I just really convinced them that they needed me full-time. So I really leveraged connections. And I think that an important lesson to take away from that is that as the curator later on, I would get resumes from a lot of people who are coming out of graduate school who framed it even in their kind of letters or outreach to me as their plan B. Like, I'm an academic and I do great work on this very specific topic, and, you know, I want to work with you. They had never done public history work. And the way that I think I was able to sell myself into this first job was actually pushing my generalist knowledge rather than my specialist knowledge. So we're taught in graduate school to just bang, bang, bang on your dissertation and your specialty. And to be honest with you, like, your specialty is not that important in the world of public humanities or public history or really anything outside of academia. I probably will never curate an exhibit on the book that I wrote. Do you know what I mean? I curate exhibits on many, many other things, and that's where my generalism comes in. And I think that's the thing you have to pitch yourself as. That is how I got my first job. It's definitely how I got my second job. It's definitely how I got the job that I'm in now. No one has ever hired me because of my specialty. And I think that's maybe one of the most important the sort of lessons that I would push today, is because we're very much inculcated to think the opposite way within academia.
Yeah. Yeah, you have to know your audience. And if your audience is professors or other faculty members, then that's the specialization matters. And if it's not, then...
Yeah, and Rachel, I would say even then within any sort of public scholar job that you have, knowing your audience is within that as well, you know, so thinking like, who is the audience of that institution? You know, are you reaching out to teachers? Are you reaching out to students? Are you reaching out to scholars? Are you reaching out to people who love history? Or are you reaching out to people who could care less about it, but love something else? Everything that we do in public institutions has to be tailored for a particular audience, and we can never assume that what works for A audience is going to work for B or C audience. And so that is another skill, I think, that ability to change that, to put those different hats on, I think is essential.
Yeah. So I have a specific question. You mentioned networking and connections a couple times and how important they were in getting that first position especially. And you said that when you were a graduate student, you approached people who work at the New York Historical Society. Can you just go into a little bit of detail about that? Because a lot of students, Francesca and I spend a lot of time talking about networking and informational interviewing and how important it is, but there's still something about it that, how do you actually do it? Who do you talk to? What do you actually say? What are you talking to them? Are you emailing them? So can you just give a couple examples?
So at the time, it was a long time ago, I reached out to the public historian, the person who had the title of public historian at the New York Historical Society. And I said, I'm a historian. I'm looking for some part-time internship work or other kind of research associate or research assistant work. I've done this kind of work. I've done this kind of writing, blog writing, tours, and obviously academic writing, but I haven't done writing for exhibitions in a museum setting. That's the skill I'd like to build. I'm offering myself to you. And she said yes. And then when I was there, I met other people while I was working there, and I would say, I'd love to be involved in that. And they would say, sure, we would love your perspective on it. And I would say and then I just remained in touch with them. So even if I was still working for them, or if I wasn't working for them, or I was taking a break, or the project came to an end, I would keep them updated on my work. I would keep them updated on things that I was interested in. I even did that with people who I never worked for, other institutions, just touching base, wanted to give you my updated resume. It may seem stalkery, but don't be stalkery. Do you know what I mean? You don't have to say, give me a job. You just say, I've been following your career. I'm really interested in the work that you're doing at the Tenement Museum. I think it's really powerful the way that you created this place-based history program. I've done some new recent things in the past couple months. I have an updated CV and I'd love to share it with you. Please let me know if you have anything going on. Again, on the other end, I contacted those people who did that with me at BHS. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. It's really useful to hear about people who are doing this kind of work, and then who are also passionate and excited enough that they keep reaching out to you. They're going to work hard for you, So I think it's a real sign of commitment to the field. I think there's a whole other conversation about the fact that I offered free labor for people, and that I, felt, that I had the financial luxury to do that. I mean, on my massive stipend from Columbia, it was not easy to do, and I didn't do a lot of hours, but that's a problem, and I've seen a lot of scholars say, just never offer free labor. And I think there's real value to what they're saying. And I think there's a real challenge in the discrepancy of people who can offer that free labor. And that's a conversation we should have, but it's really difficult to not.
Yeah.
And from the perspective of somebody who has always worked at nonprofits, there isn't always money to pay people. Although I will say that in my position, I never had somebody work for me for free who was really good, where I didn't eventually find money for them. Mm-hmm. And that was also my experience when I was in graduate school.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. And there are more programs now than when you were in graduate school too, and getting more and if they don't exist yet, but on the horizon, programs of finding ways for students to, whether it's, yeah, like part of a course that they're taking to gain a little bit of experience, or if they can get a little bit of like a stipend for working for an organization.
I will say, let me say one more thing about this networking thing, because I also think there's inter-institution networking once you get in, okay? And so in my first job, I was hired as a historian, and I had just gotten my PhD. I was overseeing 6 part-time researchers, and I was kind of like a primary liaison on this particular part of the exhibition. But I wanted to learn nitty gritty stuff. So when I was at New York Historical, the people who I got closest with were the people in the exhibition and design department. I wanted to know everything I could about exhibition design. I went to meetings where we talked about the thickness of plexi as related to the reverberations that would come off of the subway underneath us. I mean, like, I didn't have to go to those meetings, but I went to every single one of those meetings. I actually think that whenever, once you come out of graduate school, I think you can be very confident in your abilities as a scholar and an adaptable scholar. Where you need the work is knowing how to answer questions about the thickness of plexi as relates to subway reverberations below you. I mean, these are, the majority of skills that I've executed sort of since graduate school have been about, will this graphic hold up? And is the text big enough? And do we have enough money in our budget for glass versus plexi? Like, that's the bread and butter of the work that I end up doing on a day-to-day basis. So whenever you can expose yourself to anything, I think particularly related to technical skills and anything related to grant writing and grant funding, always take those opportunities. Just ram yourself right in there.
That's good advice. A student had a specific question about what year, like in your graduate career, did you reach out to the New York Historical Society and start branching out like that?
So my first year, I don't think I did anything outside, because your first year of graduate school is bewildering and terrifying. And it's kind of designed as such. My second year, I started teaching, and that is when I started, and I loved the experience of teaching because I felt that it was very professionalizing, and I wanted more of that. I wanted more work experience that didn't just make me feel like I was sitting at home reading books that intimidated me, And so I think that's when I started working at the Rare Book and Manuscript Library. And then I think in my third year is when I started Big Onion. Mm-hmm. And then maybe my third or fourth year is when I reached out to New York Historical Society, and I took 7. I took 6 or 7 years to finish. Mm-hmm. I think I took 7 years to finish. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's still customary. It's usually 6 or 7. Yeah. Yeah. Great, that's helpful. Okay, so broadening out, we talked about this a lot, calling this session Conversations in Public Humanities, and calling your career as a public historian or in the public humanities. And a lot of students come to us saying that they're interested in a career in the public humanities. What is the public humanities? How would you define it?
Yeah, I think it's fantastic to want a career in the public humanities. And I think, as Rachel and I have been talking a little bit about this panel, I've been pushing back a little bit on the term, in the sense that I find that it's an enormously valuable concept, similar to public history, public scholarship, that I probably have not heard come out of the mouth of anybody who is not in academia in the past 10 to 15 years. And I just say, we don't really talk about things like public humanities outside of these more kind of conceptual or theoretical frameworks of talking about the fields. And so I think, what is the public humanities? Like, if you were asking me to define it, I think the most sort of the definition that holds together across fields best is that it would be your job as a scholar within the public humanities to take complex and rich scholarship and make it accessible and relevant to many different audiences whose jobs are not to understand these fields. And so I think there's 2 parts to that, right? It's not like a dumbing down, right? It's actually the maintaining of the complexity of the ideas, but finding ways of communicating them, illuminating them, making them evocative, making them important to a high school student, to a high school teacher, to anybody coming into an institution off the street, to somebody who is interested in citizenship but has no knowledge about your field. You're a translator in a way. And so I think that would be my definition of it. And then to just the linguistic question about what is the public humanities, for me, the really important thing is that I don't really think of it as a field. I think of it as a concept, an intellectual concept, and that in practice, you would almost never deploy language like that, because even the term, to me, thinking about using that in the context of the public feels intimidating, and feels overly intellectual and alienating in a way that that's the opposite road. I think I would want to go down in thinking about it within a public institution.
Mm. So if a student were to come to you for, say, an informational interview, and what would be a better way for them to frame it instead of saying, I'd like to talk to you, Julie, because I'm interested in a career in the public humanities?
I think I would have no problem with somebody coming to me and talking about it in that way, but I don't know that I would ever use it in a job letter, unless maybe you're like pitching yourself as like a professor of the public humanities, because that's what the institution pinned it as, do you know what I mean? And I certainly wouldn't talk about it in relation to the work that I do as I described it to the public. Does that make sense? So, I think it is important to think about people who choose not to go into a university setting as still a part of academia and still very interested in conversations about the nature of fields and the way that we deploy our intellectual knowledge in a non-university setting, and so I welcome the conversation about that term today, but I do think it's important to think about deploying it like within that context and not within the context of like the professional work that you do. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I think there's better ways of describing it, like you make collections accessible to the public if it's the work that you do, or you want to show the relevance of, urban sociology to, people in an urban setting. So you're doing a place-based exhibition, or like concretize the work that you do with that audience.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, the word humanities even is, a lot of people don't know what that refers to.
100%. We did actually some very interesting word testing. When I was at Brooklyn Historical Society, we opened a second location of the institution along the waterfront, and it was situated in a largely commercial area. It's the Empire Stores building, if anyone has been over there. So there are restaurants below it, there are offices above it. We were the only cultural institution represented there. And so we recognized the history that we were doing we weren't drawing museum goers, right? We were drawing almost accidental museum goers who were actually going to like West Elm to buy a pillow. And so we wanted to do some language testing to think about what words would draw people in. And we got negative feedback to history. We got negative feedback to museum. We got negative feedback to humanities. We actually didn't get any positive feedback, which is like another conversation. So we really struggled with what we were going to be calling ourselves. You know what I mean? But I think it is important. Like humanities is probably one of the least positively testing words for a general public. I would say they would respond better to even just the field that you're in than they would to the larger bucket of humanities. And I think humanities is a useful thing for us because often when you're doing this kind of work, you are crossing discipline. Do you know what I mean? So there's no reason that somebody with a PhD in AM studies or sociology or political science can't work in a history museum. You know what I mean? And in fact, you should be willing to put on different hats and invite different methodologies into the work that you do. But we just don't call it that to the public for fear of alienating them from the work that we are working so hard to make accessible to them.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, I just have two more questions. And one was something that students want to know about too. We're talking about public audiences, and a while back you said people don't care, your exact specialization isn't so important, but you have written a book, and I know students are curious to hear about that. And so how and why did you write your book?
I'm not really sure how, except I can tell you that it took decades, which is not which is a significant point to me. Okay, yeah, this is a really good question. So my book is based on my dissertation, and I think the value of it having taken so long between finishing my dissertation, which I did in 2010, and the publication of my book, which is in April of next year, is that the lessons of ways of communicating with the public have now been inculcated into my book, which they wouldn't have been had I done a really big quick turnaround after that. And I think it's a significantly better book for it. And I think that beyond that book, the way that I'm thinking about my future publication projects is almost wholly shaped by my public facing work. Beyond this, I have like 3 book ideas. I'm not sure which one I'm going to pursue next, but they're all thinking about a public audience, and actually a trade press. So I think that I really do think that only good things can come to your scholarship by working with a public audience for many, many years. I think it made me a better writer. I think it made me a better thinker. And so that I'm grateful for. Despite I had this thing hanging over my head for a very, very long time. The why is because I have things to say that I think aren't necessarily suited for an exhibition. Do you know what I mean? That are storytelling, that are textual, that are best served in written form. And so that's why I did it, because I kept believing in the project, and I really, even after all these years, think it's a really great project, and it tells wonderful stories, and I like telling stories. And it's actually refreshing to be able to tell richer, longer stories than in my everyday life when you have to describe the American Revolution in 250 words, which is its own challenge. And then the how is the hardest, because there's no motivation outside of academia to work on your own work, except for the motivation that comes from within, which is often a battle with a battle between the work that you get paid for and the work that you just don't get paid for. And in fact, on the other side of publishing an academic press book that you sometimes pay for out of your own pocket, which is a deeply painful experience. And so it's wholly self-motivated, which is one of the reasons why it took me so long. I mean, another reason why it took me so long is I had children, and I think that's really worth stating. They were probably a bigger distraction than my job. They made it so that the actual answer to how is 5 o'clock in the morning. And after working for BHS for about 7 years and doing, I think, really excellent work for them, I told them that I wanted to take a partially unpaid 6-week sabbatical, and they said yes. And I did it, and I got it done. And I was actually pregnant during that, which was another huge motivator. So I would recommend that to anybody. You will get the work done. But I would say, like, my job that pays me and my children were both enormously rewarding and enormously distracting. And so it was very, very difficult to stay on topic. And I have absolutely no clue how I will do my next book. I just have no clue, but I want to.
Yeah. That's super. Yeah, that's so helpful to hear, because I used to work for an organization called ACLS, American Council of Learned Societies, on the public fellows program, and it was often a question. So there was many fellows who were just finishing their PhDs and working for 2 years in nonprofits, and many of them were trying to figure out how to publish, and to the extent when in the day or the week you can do it. And it's really helpful to know too that you got to a point in your career when you could ask for even an unpaid or partially paid leave, because I think it's good too for people to know that, these are possibilities that, like, you might not imagine. And, it's not, in your first year at a job, you're not gonna be able to, take Fridays off so you could write your book or something. Like, that's not gonna be an option, but just imagining the kind of medium term or longer term possibilities, I think, is important.
Yeah, and I think there's also, I've had like sort of ongoing conversations and debates among colleagues in similar positions to me about whether you want your scholarship to align with what your institution does. And I think actually there's pluses and minuses on both sides, but I loved having my own work be kind of separate than the work I did at BHS and now at NYPL. I found it really healthy. And I also found, like, just on a very practical level, there was sort of like no questions about intellectual property, because that is a really important thing to consider when going into any kind of public facing work or working for a public institution, is that your institution has claim to the label copy that you write, you know, to the exhibitions that you put up. They're paying you to do it. And I think, you know, there really actually are no established standards on how much of that work is yours and how much of that work is the institution's. And a lot of it relies on the kind of beneficence of the institution. So that felt like a really healthy boundary for me. This is a project I worked on before I came to BHS, which is where I spent most of my career in the past decade. And it's a project that came out after I left BHS, and it was really never connected to BHS. And there was value to that for me, even as it meant that they didn't necessarily take on the value of me doing that work, you know?
Yeah. Great. So my last question, and then I'll turn it over to students for questions, is what advice would you have for students in the audience right now? And that's, you know, I think your own experience has been really instructive, but given COVID, given, I mean, we talked a lot about finances, and just given the current state of the economy, what advice would you have for students who want to get into a career path like yours?
I think I've given a lot of it along the way, but the one I will reiterate the most is that whatever way you can get your foot into an institution, get it in and make yourself indispensable. When I think about the people who followed similar paths to me, who have found success at institutions, it's not because they went in talking about my project, because in fact, that does not make you indispensable. It actually makes you very dispensable, right? Because it's an easy cut, like your project is done. And I don't even mean that about your own research. I even mean like, if, curators who go in thinking only about their one exhibition, you know, that those are easy, particularly as funding, you know, ebbs and flows. Those are easy things to jettison. The people who stick are people who make themselves available and work closely and collaboratively with design, with education, with development, who are resources to all people in an institution, who see themselves as the liaison for an institution between the scholarly world and the world of nonprofits or public institutions. And if I was thinking about this in preparation for this, if I could think about a through line of like things that worked for me, it was that, you know, it was getting to a place and nobody knows who you are. And when you leave, whether it's a year or later, everybody's like, she really brought a lot to that institution. You know what I mean? Not just in her one exhibition, but in everything that she contributed that is ancillary to that. Now, I want to just say, I think that there is actually a kind of a gendered component to that. I've thought a lot about this. Like, I think that women kind of make themselves available in these ways, do you know what I mean? Both like in a teaching environment and outside of a teaching environment. And I would love to have a conversation about like kind of the implications of that and what it means to not trumpet your work, right? But to instead be a support for another. I think that's the real dark side and downside, I think, to what I'm describing. And then kind of that comes up against your previous question, Rachel, about one's own scholarship. Do you know what I mean? But whatever they are, these are the paradoxes of this world, you know what I mean? Both in and out of academia that I describe. So those are none of my lessons are like happy ones, fully happy. They all come with, I think, their own caveats and challenges and downsides.
Yeah, but that's really helpful. And just to know, like, different parts of your life, like your job isn't your entire life or your entire intellectual existence, that there are different pieces. And we talk a lot about that with students as well.
And to tie it to COVID, I mean, it's a very interesting thing, like, you know, working in museums. Now I work in a library, which is a little better, but none of it's great COVID-wise, you know. you know, I know a lot of people who were laid off. Do you know, like just a lot of people who lost their jobs in this context. And the people that kept their jobs were those people who had those tendrils everywhere. And I actually think that's a really important thing to point out, because right now, so many of our questions are financial. You know, what is it? Can I get a job? What field is not, you know, sinking underwater? I mean, these are, you know, really everything that we think about right now, it has to be enormously financially practical. And so that, I think, is important context to emphasize.
Yeah. Great, thank you.